Good morning, everyone. I am Trisha Liu, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Joyce. Professor Joyce is the Professor of Economics at Wellesley College and the Faculty Director for the Madeleine Korbel Albright Institute for Global Affairs. Professor Joyce was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and as you will soon hear, still has traces of a New York accent. He received his Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service and International Affairs at Georgetown University, an education that prepared him for his role and participation today in the Albright Institute. And while at Georgetown University, Professor Joyce took a course in international affairs, economics, a subject that fascinated him so much it influenced him to study economics at Boston University, where he received his master's and PhD. Professor Joyce's research deals with issues in financial globalization. He's extensively published articles on economics and released his book last year on the International Monetary Fund and global financial crises. But aside from his impressive background, he is happily married and has 2 teenage daughters, one of whom finished her first semester at Scripps College in Southern California. He's a beloved professor of economics at Wellesley College and is known for his weekly Friday poetry readings. So without any further ado, Professor Joyce.
Thank you. Next week, I believe I'm scheduled to come over one evening to the dorm to visit with you. And we'll talk a little bit about the Institute. And among the things we'll do is talk a little bit about the history of it, but also the future of it. So I'd be delighted to come back to the issue about long-term goals and discuss that. And that's the first point I want to make. And the second point is that we did indeed start yesterday, but as Farheen has admitted, I wasn't going to put her on the spot. We were not quite all here. Luckily, she made it in from Mumbai last night, and so now finally all 40 of us are here. So in a sense, this might almost be the real beginning now that we're all here. So having said that, I just wanted to take a second, Anna, and ask you all to look around and realize you're looking at 39 new biffles. And a biffle, I found out from my daughters, is a best friend for life. So one of the advantages of joining the Institute is that you automatically gain 39 biffles. Now you think I exaggerate. I don't. You'll spend 3 weeks in this room listening to the same group of people. You'll have meals every day with each other and discuss what you heard. You'll work together in groups. And at the end, 2 weeks on this Friday, I will again remind you about my comment, and you will realize it wasn't quite that much of a joke. That you will share an experience together, the 40 of you, that quite frankly, no one else at Wellesley does. And obviously, you all have good friends here and will continue to have friends, but the women in this room will, in a sense, know what you went through in the Institute in a way that no one else can. And one of the purposes of the Institute is to join you and keep you joined in the future. And so one of the long-term goals is indeed to form a network that will continue over time. And as part of that network, you listen, as you did last night, to the women who have taken the Institute in past years. And in 1 year, and 2 years, and 3 years, we'll ask some of you to come back and to be part of the Institutes that we offer in future Januaries. So this notion about the importance of the other people in the room is absolutely correct. There's no question about that. And something for you to think about as we go forward from here. Okay, so now I'll wear my professor hat and get ready to talk to you about global public goods. And this morning we really have a 2-part presentation. So I'll speak for the first part and our guest speaker will then come up after a brief break. And we'll be talking about global public goods and then Monica will talk about one in particular. So what I'd like to do in my half is kind of give you the big picture of globalization. So we're going to cover roughly 150 years of history in maybe 10 minutes. So it'll be very much an overview in which I'll glide past a lot of important points along the way. And then talk about some of the main challenges to globalization. And from that, we'll see we can go to global public goods, which I'll define for you. And talk then at the end about IGOs and NGOs and all sorts of things like that. And so we'll wrap up with that, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll continue the morning's presentation. Okay? So that's what we're doing. So let's get ready for a really rapid view of globalization. What do we mean by globalization? Well, in a sense, it's an odd question to ask. We've had globalization ever since the first people came out of Africa and crossed into Asia. So in a sense, there's always been globalization. But in the context of how we're talking about it usually today, at least from the economist point of view, which is not the only one, but the one that I know, globalization takes place when the national domestic markets in products, things that we buy, in financial assets, and in labor open their borders. so that there can be trade in goods and services, so that people can place their money anywhere they want around the world, and when people looking for jobs can go to wherever the best job for them is. Okay? If that happens, one of the results will be that the price of goods around the world will begin to converge, that the returns on financial capital will begin to become more close to each other, and that the wages that people receive for their jobs will become closer to each other. But that's only if all the barriers are removed. And in reality, as I'm about to show you, that isn't quite what's happened over the last 150 years. There might be 1.5 steps forward and a step backwards, and another step forward and another step backward. So globalization is very much an uneven process. It is not a strictly linear one. So let's start with the story. And the story really begins in the 1870s. So we begin with a photo of a bunch of white guys with mustaches, and they're standing around looking very formal. So I'm guessing at least somebody took American history in high school and probably got a 5 on their AP exam. So you tell me, what are we looking at? Anyone? What are we looking at? Do you know?
Is this the World Trade?
Is it Laura?
Yes. Was this the joining of the railroads from the East Coast?
The joining of the mighty Union Pacific with the mighty Central Pacific Railroads in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah. Thank you, Laura. And that's important because it represented the first transcontinental railroad in the United States. And it wasn't just the United States where what was becoming a revolution in transportation was taking place. And so steam power obviously powered these locomotives, which were able then to make these long distance runs, so that all of a sudden really large countries, Russia, the United States, Canada, Argentina, could become more unified so that, for example, farmers within these areas could send their products out of the central part of the country to the ports that might have been on the coast. So this revolution became very important. It began to unite people and goods across continents. Of course, once those goods got to the ports, they had to go somewhere. So in the 1870s, they now would be placed not on wooden sailing ships, but on steam-powered iron or steel ships. And so the revolution in transportation wasn't just on land, it was also across oceans. So that now those farmers could send their products, for example, to the ports, and they could be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, for example, if that's what we're talking about, from the United States to the markets of Europe. And they could come back with people, migrants, who were coming out of Europe to the United States. So transportation totally changed during this period. And we began the process whereby we could count on being able to travel across continents, unless, of course, we're in Mumbai and all of a sudden we're being told that the planes are not flying, but that's a different issue. So certainly a revolution in transportation, okay? And not just transportation, but also communication. So I'll tell you what those guys are doing. They are laying the transatlantic cable that obviously then allowed communication to go from the United States and Canada, for example, to Britain and the rest of Europe. And so messages that at one time might have taken 10 days, a couple of weeks to get across the ocean, now it takes literally a few minutes at most. And so now all of a sudden we become more aware of each other, just literally in terms of communication, okay? So that was in a sense the things that began off, if you like, this first era of globalization, the improvements in transportation and communication. And as a result, exports, the goods that are traded across borders, as a proportion of total world output rose from about 4.5% of world output in 1870 to 8% in 1913. So goods were flowing across the oceans and money was flowing as well. For example, British savings would be invested in what were called the emerging markets of that era. And in that time, the emerging markets were indeed the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina. And as I said, people also were traveling in those ships. For example, during this period, about 22 million people migrated out of Europe to go to places such as the United States and Australia. So the world literally began to come together in terms of the products, the money, the people. And as a result, we see this incredible growth that really begins to take place on an international basis of roughly income per capita going up by 1.3% a year. In other words, from about $870 average world GDP per capita in 1870 to about 1,500 in 1913. It's also, though, we should point out where it was a period in which there was basically one hegemonic power, which was the United Kingdom. So this was the heyday, if you like, of the British Empire. So that's the first era of globalization that many people thought would last forever, and that the world would simply continue to grow and become more unified. But of course, that's not quite what happened, because in 1914, this whole process came to a stop, and World War I broke out. It was over by 1918, but then we entered this uneasy period between 1918 and 1939 called the Interwar period, where some governments tried to go back to the days of the first era of globalization, but they were unsuccessful. And then in the 1930s, of course, we have this great world economic contraction known as the Great Depression. And governments respond by basically closing down their borders. They try to slow down goods from overseas coming in within their country to compete with the domestic producers. They try to keep out workers from overseas trying to compete for jobs. And so all of a sudden, globalization does indeed begin to go into reverse. In the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president. In other countries, other people come to power, such as Hitler in Germany and Stalin in Russia. And of course, by 1913, we come to the beginning of World War II. So this is clearly a period which is very much different from the first era of globalization. But it does end in 1945. And we begin the next era, starting at the end of World War II. So who are those folks sitting around tables speaking to each other? And the answer is they are the delegates to a conference that took place not too far from here, up at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Bretton Woods, you may know if you look at the ads, is a well-known resort. And in 1944, they opened it up to bring together delegates from the Allied powers. Now, the war was still on, but they knew it was coming to a close. They knew they were going to win. And they were thinking about the post-war world. And one thing they were determined to do was not to go back to the 1930s. They knew how bad things had been, and they knew how those bad economic conditions were in part responsible for the war that broke out in 1939. So they were determined at Bretton Woods to change the rules of the game so that the new international economic system would be very different from the previous one. So they decided at that time that they would now start to bring down trade barriers. And they did. And as a result, exports began to boom during this new era of globalization. They fixed their exchange rates so that currencies would not be used to try to compete with each other. They put regulations on capital flows so that money could not overcome a government's attempt to stabilize their own economy. Those were the Bretton Woods rules that lasted until 1973. And we enter a golden age of growth, particularly in Western Europe, which is recovering from the war, Japan, the United States, but growth in general around the globe. And now world per capita GDP is rising at about 3% a year, from maybe 2,100 in 1950 to 4,100 in 1973. And now, of course, we have a new hegemonic power by the end of World War II, and that's the United States. And the United States becomes clearly the main global power during this period. So that's the Bretton Woods era. It comes to an end in 1973 for a number of reasons. And we enter what I will call the third era of globalization. And I decided to show the third era by showing you a container ship, because maybe no other image so much encapsulates the revolution that happened now, particularly in transoceanic shipping. And now, all of a sudden, because of container ships, we have larger and larger ships that are able to carry more and more goods across the ocean. And these days, many of those goods are crossing the Pacific. So now we have post-Bretton Woods. We have different types of exchange rate regimes, floating, fixed, what have you. We have money flowing around the world, and growth becomes more widespread. And we begin to see growth by 10% a year in China, something which no economist would have dreamed of before the third era of globalization. 8% in India. And because China and India have so many people, the fact that those two countries are growing so rapidly means that there's a real spread of the benefits of globalization to include those countries. So world per capita GDP rises by 2003 to $6,500. The downside is that, however, we begin to see financial crises. And they take place in Mexico in 1994, East Asia in 1997, Russia, Brazil, Argentina. And so there's something going on here. On the one hand, we do have the deregulation of capital and the change in exchange rate regimes, and there seems to be some positive benefits from that. On the other hand, we see a downside, and that's the financial crises. During this period, there was a real stratification across countries. At the top now, we have not just the United States, but we have the G7. So the United States, Canada, several European countries, and they literally are at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, in terms of wealth and influence. Below them become the emerging markets of this period, which are the Indonesias, Koreas, Argentinas, Brazils, Turkeys. And these are countries which begin to grow rapidly during this period, but seem to have periodic financial crises, so they need to turn elsewhere for help. And at the bottom, we do have continued poverty in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America. So there's a real sense of different countries with the G7 kind of being at the very top. Okay? Except then things change again. And in 2008, we have another crisis, except now it's not in the emerging markets. Now it starts in the United States, right away includes Western Europe. So all of a sudden, things are turned around. And the financial crisis is not a crisis of emerging markets. It's very much of these advanced economies. And as a result, we have a real shift in power from the original 7 to what's called the G20. So those are the G20 leaders waving at you. I was delighted to count 3 women up on that screen. So that's progress of a sort, okay? At least now they're sitting at the table. And we have the rise of the emerging markets of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, while the upper income countries, like the United States, now face high debt and aging populations. And the G20, who I just showed you, in a sense, take the place of the G7, and they include the G7 and the BRIC countries, as well as several other countries such as Argentina, Mexico, Korea, Turkey. You see the list on the board. Okay? So there's a real sense of change now. It's not just that top group of advanced economies. In a sense, it's more democratic. It includes other countries as well. And now there's a sense that governments might have more responsibility for how their economies do, and that there will be more controls and regulations on financial flows. So there might be a partial return to the Bretton Woods days. And that's something that right now is still being debated. Okay? So that's the brief overview of globalization. I know I'm going by really quickly. If by any chance I manage to keep your interest in it, a marvelous book about globalization was written by a very famous, well-known political scientist over at Harvard called Jeff Frieden, and it's called Global Capitalism. Global Capitalism. I have it up on the board. And I know have copies of it down in Clapp Library. And it's just a marvelously well-written book, and you can just go through it very quickly, and just wonderful anecdotes about the 20th century and the things that I've been telling you about. Okay, so that's the big picture. So now we're going to look at globalization in a different perspective. A lot of good things happened during globalization, but there are a couple of downsides, some things that maybe were not so good. The first of all is that the benefits of globalization were not equally spread. There's a real disparity in income per capita across nations. So, for example, in 1870, if you look at the richest and the poorest countries, and you compare their income per capita, the variance is about 5 to 1. The richer countries, the United States, for example, are about 5 times richer per person than the poorest countries. That disparity rises to 18 to 1 by 2003. So clearly, yes, everyone is growing, but some are growing a lot more quickly than others. Okay? We do see, however, some interesting things. We see that poverty does begin to go down in Asia and Latin America, initially not so much in Africa. I will tell you, though, that I'm a little careful on that last statement. We think that there's some big changes before 2008, particularly in Africa, that a number of African countries now began to accelerate their growth. And so you start looking at places like Ghana, Uganda, and you begin to see, yeah, something's going on here. These countries are beginning to hit their own growth paths. So we don't have all the data yet for that period, but I suspect in a year or two I'm going to have to update the slide and talk about the growth in Africa. But nonetheless, you still have this disparity. So clearly, some people, some countries do a lot better in globalization than others. Second problem is the one I alluded to a few minutes ago, and that's this volatility in financial flows. That foreign finance can help promote growth, but it can also lead to instability. Okay? However, you don't see financial instability in China or in India, and the reason is very clear. They kept capital controls post-Bretton Woods, and so as a result, they weren't part of that East Asian crisis of 1997 that I alluded to. Okay? So the question here is, how do we get the benefits of financial flows without making countries vulnerable to crises? And that's very much an unanswered question. Okay? And the third one that I want to get to is the problem of what is sometimes called collective goods collective welfare. And I'll start with this quote from a marvelous economist, Manker Olson, who died relatively young in his life, and it was a great loss because if he had lived another 10 years, he very easily could have won the Nobel Prize. And Manker Olson was very, very fascinated and just really talked a lot and wrote a lot about collective welfare and the need for what I'm going to define in a second as public goods. And he identified, for example, the desire for peace, for orderly arrangements for trade, for the advance of knowledge, for an ecologically viable planet. We all share that. No one doubts those are things that we need. And yet these things, these collective goods, are only episodically or scantily supplied. So that's when I want to spend a few minutes talking about that particular topic. Okay? So we're going to talk about global public goods. So now here comes the hardcore economic stuff. Relax, you'll survive, those who are not economic majors, okay? It won't hurt, okay? So I'm going to introduce a few economic concepts. And the first is the notion of rivalness. And rivalness in a good is very simple. It means that if, for example, you look at this bottle of water, only one person can drink it. You don't get to all, at least in the sense of drinking all the contents, okay? We could pass it around and sip from it, but the point is that there's only so much water to go around. So if it's my bottle and I'm thirsty, I'm going to drink it. And once I use it up, it's gone. Can't have it anymore. That's rivalness. Excludability means that I got that bottle because I bought it. And the person selling it could decide who she was going to give it to. And she was going to give it to whoever gave her the money. And so the producer of the good can decide who gets the good. And in our economy, that means those who can pay for it. So these notions of what's called rivalness and excludability simply mean that most goods are characterized by them. For example, food, the water I mentioned, clothing, things like that. And those are most goods that we think about. They're characterized that way. But there are some goods that are characterized by non-rivalness, which means that many people can use them simultaneously, and non-excludability, which means that the producer has to, once she gives it to one, give it to all. Non-rivalness, non-excludability. So think for a minute about what I might be thinking about. And I'm going to try very hard not to call upon an economics major because that would be way too easy. So Yi-Ling, I'll ask you. First of all, are you an econ major?
I took Econ 101.
Do you remember it? Well, let's see how well you remember it. Can you think about this type of good, what I might be talking about?
Military defense.
So it's certainly defense. So right away, I realize that's very different from a bottle of water. Defense is something that once is available for one particular area, presumably is available for everybody. And whoever provides that defense, in a sense, can't say, we'll give it to this group and not that group, at least within a particular area. So that is indeed exactly a very nice example. Okay? So these are goods where we have what are called market failure. These are public goods. And in the case of the public good, markets don't work. Think about it. On the one hand, why should you as a consumer buy anything when you know that if your buddy buys it, you'll be able to get it as well, enjoy it with her? Similarly, why would a producer produce it? Because they know as soon as they make it available to one, no one else will buy it. And so they lose all the rest of the sales. So private markets don't work so well with public goods. Okay? There is an answer, and that is to have a government come in. Because the government can compel us to pay taxes to pay for the public good and then make sure that it's distributed to all those who are part of that population. So the government, if you like, is a response to the failure of the private markets. Okay? So another example of a public good besides national defense, a little more prosaic, a traffic light. Think about it for a second. You're driving through Wellesley Square, and there's the traffic light in the center of the square. Certainly it is non-rival. In fact, when I drive in and look at it, I'm praying that everybody else is looking at it as well, and everybody is looking at whether or not it's red or green. So it is most definitely non-rival. And once the town government decided to put up that traffic light, it became available to all. They couldn't say, I'm sure they would love to, only taxpayers get to enjoy the advantage of the traffic light because that would lead to chaos, okay? So the traffic light, even when as complicated as that, is a nice example of a public good, okay? So public goods, once we start thinking about them, we can think of a number of examples. I want to talk about global public goods because with global public goods, the market failure takes place on a global basis. It's not just within a particular area. And these are indeed going to be the global public goods. And again, there are many examples, and the one we'll be talking about more this morning is a clean environment. Clean environment we all get to enjoy. and usually, again, within a particular area. Once it's provided to one, it's available to all. And you can probably think of other examples, such as global health, financial stability. These are all examples of global public goods. Okay? The problem with global public goods is whether or not governments are going to provide them. And if you think about it, we have on the global basis the problem that you have on the national basis among governments. Because with the global public good, all governments know that if someone else provides it, then they get to share in the benefits. So why should any one government pick up the tab of paying for a global public good when they know that other governments might be willing to do it and they get to enjoy the benefits? So that's the challenge with the global public good. It's not a market failure as much as a government failure once we come up to this. Okay? Now, that kind of exaggerates it a bit and makes it sound like we never get global public goods. And we'll talk later on this morning about whether or not that's true or not and how governments can, in some circumstances, cooperate. So I don't want you to think we don't ever get to a situation where there's some provision, but you do see some of the problems that makes governments want to hang back a bit and let someone else step forward first. Okay? So we will see stories about situations where there may be some incentive for governments to collaborate, at least to a certain extent. Okay? When governments do collaborate, they very often will use what's called an intergovernmental association, an IGO. And an IGO is very simply an association that's been set up by governments for a specific purpose, such as providing a global public good. Okay? So the IGO is there to help governments come together in order to help them deliver this global public good. The IGOs usually have secretariats, groups of people, offices if you like, that help provide them to do the work of the organization. They provide information. They help resolve coordination problems amongst the different governments who are involved. They lower the cost of collective action. They make it easier. Okay? So IGOs help do all these things when they're used by national governments. Among the examples I threw up on the screen, of course, that's the biggest, most well-known, would be the United Nations. The UN, located in New York, but located around the world as well, is there basically to help provide political stability on an international basis. Okay? Other examples might be the International Monetary Fund, which I study, which provides economic and financial stability with the member governments. The World Health Organization, right away we know from its name what it does. And you could probably think of other examples as well. There are many examples of types of intergovernmental organizations. But they're all there for the reason of helping national governments to provide global collective goods. A couple of points about IGOs. People expect a lot from them because as globalization continues and the linkages between nations become stronger, we become more aware of each other. And as we become more aware of each other, we become more aware of the problems of globalization. And as a result, the demand for international public goods increases. And so people turn to these IGOs and they say, hey, aren't you responsible for providing political stability, economic stability, health, environmental, what have you? And we expect these IGOs to do exactly that, to provide those public goods. But that's a problem with that. And the problem is that these IGOs are simply associations. There's no way that they can force members, usually, a few exceptions I can talk about, but there's usually no way they can force the members to do something that the members do not want. And so one fast example, in the last decade, there's a lot of concern about, on the economic scene, about what are called global imbalances, which were the balance of payments between the United States, China, and other countries as well. They were very much, in a sense, out of sync from what we expect them to be. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, literally got this group of countries, about 5 of them, to come together and send representatives to the IMF in Washington to resolve these global imbalances. And so that was in 2007. So it is an attempt by the IGO of the IMF to bring some of its members together to deal with this collective problem of what we call global imbalances. And the result was very disappointing because the United States pointed its finger at China and said it's all China's fault. It's because of what they're doing to exchange rates. And the Chinese pointed their fingers at the United States and said it's their fault. Their fiscal policies are out of control. They don't know what they're doing. And the Europeans had their excuse and the Japanese had their excuse. And basically nothing was decided. And there was nothing the IMF itself could do independently to try to resolve the problem. All it could do was try to foster coordination. That's the best it can do. So unfortunately, that failure helped lead to the crisis of 2008. So the point is to realize that IGOs are somewhat limited in what they can do. They can't force their members to do things that the members do not want to do. They can try to persuade their members to enact policies, but the problem is that those policies may constrain the power of the domestic government. And I assure you, no domestic government is going to give up its autonomy over its own area to some international organization. That's just not what's going to happen. So I want you to realize that there are limitations on what these IGs always can do. Okay? So that's one actor we should know when we talk about global public goods, but it's not the only one. There are also non-governmental associations, NGOs. And these are obviously private organizations that exist to try to advance some particular policy goal. And so these are voluntary organizations of people who come together because they feel strongly about some issue. Okay? So just for fun, let's think on a domestic basis within, say, a country, US or any other country. What might be an example of an IGO, of an NGO that perhaps you've come across? And I know from having read your applications that many of you have had very real experience. So what might I be speaking about? Sure. So Kimmy, do you mind running up?
Clinton Foundation count?
The what?
Clinton Foundation.
The Currency Foundation. I'm sorry. Oh, the Clinton Foundation. Thank you. That certainly would count. Although I would say I want to put them aside. I think of them more as an international IGO. So in my head, I'm just thinking anything, for example, within one country. So Anna, and I'll repeat what Anna says. So.
I would say like a microfinance institution.
Okay, so Donna is saying a microfinance institution, and there are many of those scattered around the world within countries. So those indeed would be an example of a non-governmental association that cares about, in this particular example that Anna gave us, the ability of people, individuals with limited income to get access to finance. And you'll probably hear more about microfinance as we go forward from here, okay? But yeah, that would be an example of an NGO, okay? An international NGO, such as the Clinton Foundation, promotes activities such as poverty reduction, environmental protection, on a global basis. So they're not just within one country, they try to operate around the world, or at least some parts of the world. So indeed, the Clinton Foundation is a marvelous example of an international NGO, and how they operate differs. Sometimes they'll work with domestic governments, and they'll work with the international governmental associations, okay? And so they'll cooperate with them to try to make them more effective. Sometimes they're a little more antagonistic, and they'll be a little more, how should we say, forceful at trying to get the attention of governments and international organizations. And so I'll just mention, for example, Amnesty International, Oxfam, and Greenpeace. If you know anything about those organizations, you know they have very interesting profiles. Greenpeace in particular has no compunction at being in the face of national governments to tell them that they're falling down on the job. Oxfam does a little bit of both. They will certainly come out and criticize intergovernmental organizations, but they'll also work on their own within countries. So you'll see different patterns of action across these organizations. And as we go forward, and as you start doing your work on the global hotspots, you want to think about this a little bit. You want to ask yourselves, are there any intergovernmental organizations at work in the area where we're studying? Are there any international NGOs at work in the area? And do they have a role to play? So that's just something to be open about, to think about as you start thinking about your individual team projects. Okay? So those are the people I want you to think about as we go forward. I want you to think about global public goods and what it is, and how it might affect, be interesting within the context of the area that you're talking about. I want you to think about the difference between domestic governments, intergovernmental associations, and the international NGOs, all of whom have different agendas and will come together or not in order to provide some sort of global public good. Okay? So the challenges of globalization, okay, are whether or not national governments can step up to the challenge of providing the global good. What indeed is the role of the intergovernmental organization? What is the role of the NGO? And lest you think we're only talking about the government, what's the role of the private sector? And that's certainly something that you will hear about as, again, we go forward and we bring our visitors in. And so you'll hear from people from national governments, IGOs, NGOs, the private sector as we go forward. And in a sense, you may want to keep this as a roadmap. What's the contribution of this person, her sector, or his sector, to this big issue about global collective welfare? What can that organization do that perhaps no other organization can do? And you'll see, obviously, there's no one right answer. It depends upon the organization we're talking about. And finally, of course, the question is you. What's your role? Don't worry, there's no exam. We're not going to grade you on your answer to that question, okay? But it's, if you like, one of the purposes of the Albright Institute is to get you to think a little bit about that. As you go forward, as you think about your own future, where do you fit in within this big picture about global collective welfare, which we know is not provided sufficiently? What is it that you could do that might help promote it in a particular area that you feel strongly about? One of the reasons of the, if you like, purposes of the Institute is to expose you over this short period to a whole range of different public goods. And it might be as you listen and learn, you hear something for the first time that resonates with you. And you say, I didn't know anything about that. That's really interesting. I should probably know more about it. And that's great. So I want to be clear that Joanne and I are not trying to push any particular agenda. If you like, our agenda is the biggest agenda possible. It's collective, it's global, and it's your role in it. And only you can answer that. We can't dictate it to you. What we can do is bring in a lot of people and a lot of examples for you to listen to get some sense of what are the possibilities out there. Okay? So again, don't worry, there's no exam on the last day of the Institute. You don't have to get up and promise that you'll pledge your life to ending hunger or poverty or what have you, but we do hope you at least think about it and just have it in the back of your mind as you go forward from here. Okay? Let's stop here and ask if there are any questions about the material that I've shown you this morning.
My name is Wangoi. So you've presented economic growth as a positive thing,
Yep.
And I'm wondering if there's, or you can talk about downsides of unbridled economic growth. Is economic growth always a good thing for everyone? Does it have to be capitalistic? And what alternatives can we call upon as capitalism is shown more and more to be in crisis?
So that's a marvelous question. I could give you a 2-hour answer, but I'll spare you and give you the maybe 3 or 4 minute answer. I'm sure I'll leave some things out, but let me just take a crack at it. Number one, certainly economic growth is not seen as an ultimate good in itself. That we can answer that question on a spiritual level, which I'm happy to do with you. Think about whether or not growth in terms of our ability to have goods and services, is that correlated with happiness or not? I suggest it's not quite that easy to think about it. Poverty is not good either, no question about that, but simply having more toys to play with at one point gets old. There actually was a study, I'll mention this very quickly because it's such an interesting issue, in which economists polled people about the things that gave them the greatest pleasure as they gained more money. And one of the results that came out is that people had longer positive feelings about experiences such as foreign travel than they did buying new toys like a new car or something like that. That when you travel together particularly and you go to a new place, that stays with you, as opposed to, oh, look what I got for Christmas, isn't it nice? And you pick it up and you have it there, you know, and a month later you've forgotten it. And so my daughter did indeed finish her first semester at Scripps College, so I have much better insight as to how my students have to live these days than I used to. And the summer before, we went on a family trip to Europe, because it was the last time I knew I could count on all of us being together. And I can assure you that experience will live with us much longer than buying a new car or something like that. So that's the first answer. Second answer. Certainly we know there's a downside to economic growth, even when there's good parts, in terms of how we achieve it and whether or not there's any sort of environmental corollary that goes with it. Because clearly that can't be good for the environment if indeed we are destroying part of the environment, and that's part of the collective welfare as well. So there's absolutely no question that economists are aware of the damage, if you like, that pure economic growth can do. Are there alternatives? Well, we should point out capitalism is kind of a broad umbrella. Okay, and there are a lot of types of capitalism. Okay, there's the capitalism that encouraged financial growth in the 1990s and the last decade in the United States, but it's not the only one. Okay, certainly we have examples of other countries that did not have the same financial crisis. Canada, for that matter, did not have the same financial crisis that the United States did, and yet they're both capitalist countries. Going further abroad, the question is whether or not we can learn anything from the experiences of China, which, as I said previously, was growing at a rate that no economist would have been able to predict. And the question is, what were they doing that might be exported to another country? The problem economists have sometimes is that we see an example of growth, and we say, all right, that's great. Now, can we apply that to everyone else? And sometimes it's hard to do that. That the growth you see might be the result of unique circumstances in that particular country. So is growth always good? Not necessarily. Poverty is not good, but there are various ways of getting out of poverty. And certainly economic growth pursued for its own end need not be a particularly positive thing for a country and its people over time. Because I'll end on this note, even if we could say, all right, we can deal with economic growth, we like to have economic growth, and we want to have it, is our achievement of today going to make it easier or harder for future generations to have it? And so the intergenerational aspect is something for you to think about as well. Good question. How about, Kimmy, we have some people down here? Or?
So do you think that lately we've been putting too much of a focus on NGOs or like international governmental organizations to bring about too much political, economic, or even social stability, or try to bring about some kind of reform, especially when it comes to political or social?
I do think that people sometimes have unrealistic expectations about what intergovernmental organizations, that the question, can do. And so people demand that the IMF do this and the UN do that, not realizing that there are constraints on what those organizations can do. And those constraints are very much imposed by the member nations. So there are different ways in which those constraints are played out. The UN, as you probably know, is one country, one vote. And there is a Security Council of a small group. And it only takes the veto of one large power on that group to stop progress on a particular issue. So the UN very much is constrained by what its members say. The IMF is an interesting story. There they have weighted voting, where the weight's based on the economic size of the country. However, those weights were first devised in 1944 at Bretton Woods, the conference I showed you, and they've been very, very slow to update them. And so until fairly recently, you would see that countries such as Netherlands, which I love, and tiny Belgium, fabulous place, had more votes at the IMF than Brazil. What's that about? Well, because in 1944, that might have made perfect sense. It doesn't in 2012. So there's a real question about the legitimacy of these organizations when they have voting schemes which in a sense are outdated and don't reflect the true distribution of power. So one, they're always going to be constrained to some extent. And number two, they need to show their own legitimacy if people are going to take them seriously. And that can be a problem with some of them. Certainly it has been at the IMF and the World Bank. Yes. Kirsten?
It's okay? Okay. Yep, my name is Kirsten, and my question is twofold. You mentioned that, well, one is, what is the capacity for governments? You talked about the fact that there are limits to the capacities of governments to maintain global public goods. For example, the public health funding is an issue. The capacity of personnel can't be provided equally across the board for all goods. And do you have any theorists come up with suggestions for how we can address those issues? And the second part of my question is, you mentioned military defense, which is a huge area in and of itself. But one of the theories about the United States' ability to maintain its rise for such a long and sustained period of time is the fact that it was willing to provide the public good of maintaining the peace between countries, and in some ways allowing other countries benefited, and therefore there wasn't a downside to it. So I guess I'm wondering if defense is running counter to other global public goods, what does that dynamic do to the market system and the trying to figure out how to articulate this, and the ways in which we prioritize access to these global public goods.
So again, those are really, really interesting topics. So let me take a crack at each of them. Again, I'm kind of giving you the brief Cliff Notes answer as opposed to the much better extended one. The first part of your question, it's really a marvelous question. And in fact, there are economists who indeed have tried to address that question in terms of how a particular global good is supplied. And some global public goods have a nature which in a sense can be given to you by thinking about an island. Think of an island in the Pacific where the waters are rising and you're trying to protect your island. So what do? You set up dikes all around the perimeter of the island. And the safety of the island is going to depend upon the ability of the dikes to keep the water out. And if you think about it for a second, if only one dike goes down, the water floods in and the island is flooded. So that type of public good is called the weakest link, because the ability to enjoy the good depends upon the weakest member of the organization, the dike in my example, or a country. And so to the extent that health is a good example, might be an example of the weakest link, where if only one country allows people who are infected from a disease to escape and therefore to travel to other countries, other people will be affected as well. In that example, okay, then an argument can be made, it's in the interest of the richer countries to help out the poorer countries to raise the common level of defense in order to provide the public good to all. So they're not doing this out of charity. It's in a sense to protect themselves from the weakest link within the system, that they should go in and provide some help to what is currently the weakest link, to raise the dikes, to make them more effective. Okay? So that would be an interesting example of a technology and type of public good, and you think a little bit about it, and you say, yeah, there's a story here I can tell about why there should be some sort of international cooperation. So that would be a type of answer to the first part of your question. The second part, of course, is about military defense. And very quickly, we talked about the United States being the hegemonic power from 1945 to 73. No question that the United States provided global security for the non-communist world. No question that enabled, for example, some European countries not to have to invest so much on the defense side because they knew about the United States being, in a sense, the protector. And the importance of the North American Treaty Organization, NATO, that Madeleine Albright is very knowledgeable about. And you may want to come back and ask her that question. There has been a tension in recent decades with the United States trying to back off from NATO a little bit in the sense of not providing all of the expenditures, people, what have you, and trying to get the Europeans to provide more. And there's been tremendous political resistance to that by some of the European nations. And so whether or not we will continue to have this global defense force is not clear, particularly because now it isn't quite clear who the enemy is. Global communism is gone. We're not worried about that. So it isn't quite clear just what the defense is defending. And so it's very much an unanswered question. So you raise an interesting point. I don't know the answer because I don't think anyone knows the answer. I think it's something that's being grappled with right now. Shuyu?
Yes.
Good.
So I have a question about the financial crisis. Is it recorded? My name is Shu Yu, and I have a question about the financial crisis. So you mentioned that China and India are not part of the 2008, well, like less to a less extent part of the crisis because they have capital control.
Yep.
But like Canada, who's definitely like participating in the international financial system, is not affected that much either. And also, I feel like from the presentation, I have an impression that financial crisis only happened when we have globalization. But there are a lot of financial crises that are just internal, like the tulip crisis, like several centuries ago in Netherlands, and also actually the housing crisis. That is orange of.
Okay, I'm trying to keep all these points in my head. All right, keep going.
The global crisis is actually come from the U.S. housing problem itself.
Right.
So I'm wondering, can you elaborate on the relationship between globalization and financial crisis? So when does a country get into financial crisis, and how much is it due to globalization?
The best way to answer that question is to take my course, International Macro, this spring. I will spend 26 classes answering it. Let me give you a very, very partial answer. One of the reasons why Canada did not have the same financial crisis that the US and other countries did, even though they were open to international capital, was because they regulated their banks very differently than the authorities in the United States did. So there's not just international regulation of financial activity, there's also domestic regulation. And countries can differ greatly in terms of what they do. And so it is basically agreed that Canada did things very differently than the US, so that when the global crisis took place, the banks in Canada were not as exposed as banks in the United States and elsewhere would be. So that would be one part of the answer. It certainly is true that a crisis can take place domestically and not affect other countries, we know that. But it is interesting to go back to my presentation that between 45 and 73, when there was international regulation on capital, we really didn't see any international crises. Yes, there were some domestic crises, no question about that. But the number of crises really escalated after the 1970s, when countries began to deregulate domestically and to deregulate on the capital side internationally. And so you began to see, for example, the story of Thailand in 1997 is undoubtedly a story in which there was a lot of money flowing in from outside pre-crisis. And then all of a sudden in 1997, investors got nervous and began to exit. And bam, we had a crisis that then spread throughout the rest of East Asia to Indonesia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and eventually Korea. And that clearly was an international crisis. Yes, there may have been some domestic vulnerability in each of those countries, but the reason why that became a crisis was the international aspect of it. So countries that have a lot of financial flows with the rest of the world are more liable to be affected by any type of crisis. Now, that doesn't mean that China and India are unaffected by this most recent crisis. That's a very different story. But they were affected not so much by financial flows as the fact that as the United States slowed down, and Europe followed it, our U.S. ability to import goods slowed down because we're not as rich, which of course affects their exports. So countries like China were affected not because of money necessarily crossing borders, but because, remember those container ships? All of a sudden there were fewer container ships crossing the Pacific to the United States, because clearly Americans were not going to buy as much foreign goods as they had because they were poorer. So there are many types of linkages in the global economy. It's not just money, which is the obvious one to kind of think about, but there's trade as well. And clearly trade flows can help a country grow to the extent that they are growing and other countries are buying your products. And conversely, trade flows can slow you down if your foreign customers all of a sudden become less willing to buy goods from you. Now, China is an interesting example because clearly the national leaders in 2008 knew exactly the problem that they faced. And one of their responses was to ramp up domestic spending. And so investment spending in China rose in 2009 precisely because the government saw what was happening and tried to counter it by having domestic demand rise to offset the decline in foreign demand for their goods and services. Okay? So I know I've given a very partial answer to a very complex question, but hopefully I've answered at least part of it. Okay? I want to take one more question and then we'll stop and we'll get ready for our speaker this afternoon. Except there's so many, right, we'll take at least 2 or 3 questions. Sarah.
So my question is about...
Hold on. And this is Zara, is that right?
Zahra.
Zahra.
So my question is about the interplay of the private sector with public goods, and if that happens. So perhaps my example won't make sense, but in my mind I'm thinking of, for example, safety and the justice system. So that's kind of a public good in America. And one way of going about promoting safety is perhaps by incarcerating people, whereas we're bringing in the private sector to build jails and to promote this. So I'm just wondering about the dynamic and the interplay between these two factors.
So I don't know that much about it, but I'm happy to take a shot at it because I have thought about it a little bit. Just recently in the United States, there have been a bunch of mini scandals whereby state governments that awarded contracts to private firms to provide certain types of services, such as providing halfway houses for people who are coming out of the prison system but weren't quite ready to get to go in society. There are problems. Turns out that some of these private firms basically pocket the money and don't do the job. And so even though as an economist I can dream of a system in which there are incentives whereby private firms could do some of the provision of the public good, got to tell you, when I look in the real world, I see a lot of breakdowns of that. So it's kind of controversial. That it's easy to make an argument that the private system can be integrated. But if the only thing that's being integrated is, in a sense, the reward, which is being given to the private firm, no guarantee they're going to provide the public good on the same basis that the government might, whereby we would think that in a democracy that the domestic government, in a sense, is constrained by the voters. So if I'm unhappy with the town of Wellesley in terms of police protection, fire protection, I can complain. And if I'm really upset, I'll call my neighbors. And we'll get together, maybe we'll do a petition. Or maybe we'll run somebody for the city council, whatever area it is. And knowing that, once we take control, we're going to get what we want. But the private firm is different because now things are being outsourced to the private firm. And the control kind of breaks down as you go across it. So you're right to kind of wonder about it. And clearly there is no simple mechanism for ensuring that private firms will indeed provide the public goods that we think they theoretically would if you worked with the local government. We'll let Anna have a question.
So something that you discussed a lot was about sometimes the lack of stability that is brought about by globalization.
Yep.
And so my question is regarding certain partnerships that are being created within different countries, like was the European Union. And we sometimes see that what ends up happening is that it just creates like an artificial sort of form of stability in some sense. And my question is, what would happen if emerging markets such as the BRICS in some sense, or some kind of less developed country tried to also pursue this kind of same union? Would they benefit from such or would they benefit with like new forms of stability within this like global economy?
So it's very easy to talk about the benefits of cooperation, coordination, and even further federalism, whereby different government units come together to form one bigger unit. And there are benefits, and as an economist I can tell you all about those benefits, but there are downsides. And the downside is that you give up certain things. And among the things you give up is the ability to control, protect, if you like, your own economy. And so if we had a representative of the German government right here, I would ask that person, what do you think about that Eurozone these days? Because they, in a sense, gave up control of their currency, which was the Deutschmark, which was a very stable currency, to join the Eurozone, which is the collective of countries who use the euro, which of course includes Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. And clearly at the time, this was seen as a good thing for Germany to do, otherwise presumably they wouldn't have done it. But now we begin to realize that, yeah, but depending upon how you design that organization, that if it's not designed properly, there may be new problems that arise. And so initially there really weren't controls on how much domestic governments could borrow. And so because they didn't do that, we had different amounts of borrowing by different governments, including Greece in particular. And as a result, we now see that, in a sense, the European Union becomes involved because one government perhaps, in this example, did more borrowing than it should have. And so that would be the downside, the vulnerabilities that you have. And we always don't know in advance what those vulnerabilities will be. So no one knew this in 1999 when they began to introduce the euro to the area. So there are benefits to more coordination, but there are dangers, and the problem is sometimes we don't quite know what the dangers are. And so that makes it kind of hard to kind of, how should we say, formulate a generic answer that always good or always bad. It depends very much on how that union is formed. And so the counterexample is the United States. And so now 50 states, obviously we began with 13 when the country began. And clearly in 1787, the question is, how are you going to form a union? And the debates over the American Constitution, they were very much aware of exactly these issues. And the decision by Alexander Hamilton to have the federal government absorb all the debt of the state governments. It's kind of interesting when you think about the European Union and Greece today. It did something very different. So you'll see different models as you look across different areas in terms of what was done. And as always, the details is what can trip you up. Why don't we let Farheen have the last question, because I'm so happy to have her back from Mumbai.
I'm Farheen. So I had a question about... Am I good to go? Okay. I'm Farheen. I had a question about the provision of global public goods. So I think we all have a sense of the relative ineffectiveness of IGOs. And a lot of people turn to INGOs like the Clinton Foundation and say that they do really good work. So are we thinking about this the wrong way? So do the restrictions of domestic governments effectively prevent them from providing global public goods to all their citizens? And should we be concentrating our efforts more on giving funds to grassroots organizations or local NGOs and other people who are more on the ground level, have more access to local people and deliver more impact on a per person basis?
Again, that's a really hard question to answer because it's such an easy, let me rephrase this. It's a good question. There's no simple answer. Certainly there are examples that you and I can think about where local organizations can be effective. And in those examples, you certainly can make a case that handling the problem on the lower level makes sense. Manker Olson wrote about this and talked about the fact that there are certain problems that can be handled on a domestic basis. Why do you need, in that case, an international organization, either public or private, to provide it? And so, again, microfinance might be an example where you don't have to have an international agency, that maybe they can be handled on a domestic basis. However, other issues are truly global. And despite the best efforts of perhaps a domestic organization, either public or private, to handle it, they may be overwhelmed by the international aspects of it. So let me think of one or two examples, okay? One is drug trafficks. So you can imagine a country being very serious, a government now, not an organization, but a government, being very serious about trying to stop drugs. But if its borders are somewhat porous, and if the other governments around it don't feel as strongly about this, there are going to be problems that one government itself cannot resolve. The second example, and I'm going to stop right here because we're going to come back to this after the break, might be environmental. How much good can one domestic organization, no matter how well intentioned, no matter how well funded, how much can it do in a truly globalized environment, literally globalized environment, whereby clearly the air you breathe depends to some extent on what happens around the world. And right away you can say that would be a problem. So yes, we might be able to handle recyclables on a domestic basis and talk about doing things, and we do. But in terms of other aspects of the environment, it's impossible to totally deal with them if you only depend upon national governments or national organizations to deal with it. They are dependent upon the big picture on the global one. So I think this is a perfect place to stop. Thank you for your questions. We're going to come back after a brief break and pick up exactly on the environment and why it's so hard to get to achieve a clean environment. Thank you.